Put it to the other one, but then you'll still have to have someone switching the slide.
Okay, ask Lynn. Lynn? Okay, Lynn, will you be the one who will...
Janet's going to do it.
Janet will do it. First, he has to know also, because there are things on 3 computers, when to switch from one to the other, and those kind of technical details. Janet will? And do you start with the communique, and then that will be Gordon.
No, I think, well, Gordon.
Ok, je pense que tu devrais aller avec les...
Who's doing this computer stuff?
Oui, mais c'est parce que là, en tout cas, il y a deux parties.
Yeah, okay, just switch it.
We're not using a PowerPoint for the first one.
Okay, so you don't want this one up here? Or?
No, not really. That will be the third one.
You'll have to tell me which one to put. So the next one's going to be the French one, or?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, because I'll need to have a cue as to when to put it out. And then someone's going to have to change the slides as we go.
Yeah, I'm doing the slides, I just don't know where I'm doing it. Owen said to speak to somebody. Are you somebody?
Yeah, it's just the room in the back there.
Yeah.
So the laptops you got to push like next or back.
Okay.
But if you can give me a cue when to switch it, because I don't know when to switch it.
I'll tell you, yeah. I thought it was per
Tu te mets au centre ou bien... Non, ok.
Bonjour, bienvenue au Théâtre National de la Presse. Hello, welcome to the National Press Theatre. With us today we have Gordon Edwards, President of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. He will speak first, and then Gilles Provost, Ralliement contre la pollution radioactive, et ensuite all Hendrickson, concerned citizens of Renfrew County and area. So, Mr. Edwards, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for turning out. And I will give the introductory remarks. After this, we're going to have a press conference. My name is Gordon Edwards. I'm president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. Tomorrow, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is holding a public meeting here in Ottawa with no opportunity for oral interventions from the public. Part of that agenda has to do with industry plans to deal with the radioactive remains of 4 defunct nuclear reactors, all owned by the federal government. These dangerous radioactive structures are a part of the larger legacy of nuclear waste that is the sole responsibility of the Government of Canada. We're not talking here about the provinces, about the provincial wastes, but only the federally owned wastes. It's a toxic legacy which is estimated by the Auditor General of Canada as a $7.9 billion public liability. This morning's information briefing session will focus on the larger question of Canada's entire nuclear liability, while the press conference that follows immediately afterwards will focus more narrowly on the question of what is being planned to be done with the radioactive carcasses of these 4 defunct nuclear reactors. They are the NPD reactor on the Ottawa River, about 30 kilometers north of Chalk River, the WR1 reactor on the Winnipeg River at Pinawa, the Douglas Point reactor on the shore of Lake Huron, Kincardine, and the Gentil 1 reactor on the St. Lawrence River just across from Trois-Rivières, all of them publicly, federally owned. The individuals and organizations represented here this morning have an important message for all Canadians. Canada is entering a new era, the age of nuclear waste. Nuclear waste has been with us, but now we're talking about abandoning this waste. That's what we're really dealing with and concerned with. Unlike the age of nuclear power, which may be winding down even as we speak, the age of nuclear waste has no end in sight as it stretches into eternity, posing serious unresolved problems for countless generations of Canadians to come. For the ultimate goal, both from the waste producers and from the regulatory agency, is to abandon these radioactive leftovers without any intention of monitoring them and or retrieving them over the very long term, hundreds of thousands of years. We feel that this approach is ill-advised and constitutes a betrayal of the public trust and a crisis of leadership on the issue of long-term radioactive waste management. Indeed, there is a near-perfect policy vacuum surrounding this question at the federal level. Canada's nuclear waste policy framework, which you will find in your press kit, is pathetic. It's made up of 273 words with 3 bullet points equivalent to 4 tweets on Twitter. And that is Canada's policy framework on nuclear waste. We're not talking here about the high-level waste, which is the irradiated nuclear fuel, but all the other multitude of wastes that result from nuclear fission. Jim Carr, until recently the Minister of Natural Resources, has acknowledged in writing, and again we have his letter in the press kit, that there is no federal government policy regarding the long-term management of human-made radioactive waste except in the case of irradiated nuclear fuel. Nor is there any policy regarding the dismantling of radioactively contaminated nuclear reactors, an operation that leads to the creation of significant volumes of long-lived radioactive rubble, much of which will remain dangerous for hundreds of thousands of years. Through inaction and lack of any adequate public consultation mechanism, the Canadian government is complicit in allowing unacceptable approaches to radioactive waste to be pursued, in violation of practices that have been consistently advocated by Canada's nuclear establishment from the very beginning of the nuclear age, and disregarding explicit standards that have been promulgated by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The Canadian government, we feel, is shirking its responsibility to establish clear policies governing the long-term management of the bulky, human-made radioactive waste materials that have been created by nuclear fission in nuclear reactors. The Canadian public has not been consulted. First Nations have not been consulted. The safety of future generations has not been adequately taken into consideration. The consortium of profit-oriented multinational corporations that were hired under the Harper government's administration to manage Canada's nuclear legacy sites seems to have been given a free hand to write its own rules. Although technically subordinate to the Crown Corporation Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, the recently created entity, Canadian Nuclear Laboratory, CNL, is owned and operated by the private consortium of what I consider to be mercenaries that is now running the show. Forget about underground repositories. CNL wants to create a giant mound of radioactive waste right on the surface at Chalk River, several stories high, to hold up to 1 million cubic meters of mixed nuclear waste. In effect, it is little more than a radioactive landfill intended to outlast the pyramids of Egypt. Forget about dismantling shut-down reactors, packaging and removing the radioactive components, as previously promised. CNL wants to turn each reactor into its own cement nuclear mausoleum for eternity, right beside a major water source that was once needed for cooling the reactor's cores. Each site, which was originally chosen to satisfy the cooling needs of a reactor, is now to be considered a permanent nuclear waste repository, simply by an affirmation of will and a CNSC rubber stamp. Ever since the dawn of the nuclear age in Canada, when the first nuclear reactor began operation at Chalk River, Ontario in September 1945, we've been accumulating radioactive waste materials that are created by the nuclear fission process. There are close to 1,000 of these human-made radioactive varieties, materials that were never detected in nature before the advent of nuclear fission. They're all cancer-causing poisons. They can also damage reproductive cells and pass on damaged genes to future generations. Exposure to these radioactive materials can cause strokes, heart attacks, and compromised immune systems, as well as mental and behavioral disabilities. For the first 30 years of the nuclear age, Canadian citizens and their elected representatives were unaware that there were nuclear waste. Nuclear power was said to be completely clean, and so one would not suspect that there was such a problem. It was portrayed as an inherently clean source of energy. When the intractable nature of human-made radioactive waste became apparent in the mid-1970s, there were official studies in many countries, including Canada, the United States, and the UK, which basically gave an ultimatum to the industry. It said, you've got to solve this problem, this nuclear waste. And they were talking about the high-level waste. If you don't solve this problem, there is no future for nuclear power. That was the message that came out of many of these reports. The focus at that time was, as I say, almost entirely on irradiated nuclear fuel, which is by far the most dangerous form of nuclear waste. But in Ontario, a Royal Commission report found that even after 10 million years, the amount of water needed to dilute Ontario's fuel waste to the maximum permissible level of contamination for drinking water is 2.5 times greater than the volume of Lake Huron. So, without going into too much detail, I'd like to point out that there are, inside every nuclear reactor, there are 3 types of nuclear materials, radioactive materials, which are created. First, there are the fission products, which are the broken pieces of uranium atoms. And that's strontium-90, cesium-137, krypton-85. You've heard of these things, iodine-131. They're all broken pieces of uranium atoms. Those are called the fission products. Then there's the transuranic elements. Transuranic elements are elements created when uranium atoms, instead of splitting, absorb a neutron and get transformed into new elements, heavier than uranium. Plutonium, americium, curium, and those types. Plutonium being, of course, of key importance for nuclear weapons, as well as a potential source of fuel for nuclear reactors. And then there is a third category, and those are called the activation products. It means that because there are neutrons flying around inside the nuclear reactor, when a neutron strikes a non-radioactive atom, it can turn it into a radioactive atom, and that's where tritium comes from. Tritium is activated. It's ordinary hydrogen, which has been transformed into radioactive hydrogen. That's where tritium comes from. That's where carbon-14 comes from, which is a 6,000-year half-life beta emitter. So these materials have long half-lives. They remain dangerous for a great deal of time. They're human-made, and we believe that there has to be a policy in Canada specifically dealing with how to manage these. When you dismantle a nuclear reactor, all of the components in the core area have become extremely radioactive. And so even after the high-level waste is removed, it's still a very radioactive structure. Also, the whole primary cooling system, including all the components along the way, the pumps, the condensers, the boilers, these all become radioactive waste. So there's quite a large volume of, and then there's the contamination that just results from handling, mops, rags, filters, resins, and so on. So it's a large body. Now, in the past, they said we're going to remove these wastes from the site and return it to greenfield status for unlimited usage, unrestricted use. But now, this consortium of private companies has said, no, we've got a better way to do it. We'll just dump all the radioactive garbage into the sub-basement and fill it with grout, fill it with cement, and just leave it there for eternity. And this is where we are calling attention today to what we consider to be an abomination. This is an abomination of a policy. This is no policy. This is a policy which is the industry writes for itself, and it's not even Canadian industry. We're talking about mostly foreign-owned corporations here. So Canadians, we feel, have got to be alert to the fact, and our elected representatives, that we are entering a new era. Never before in the history of Canada have we actually given permission to abandon these dangerous materials unmonitored. Now, they will look after them for 100 years or so, they say. But ultimately, the goal is to abandon them. And by putting them in the state they're talking about, cement mausoleums and huge mounds, landfills, it means that nobody can go back there and easily retrieve this situation, retrieve the waste, repackage them, and do a proper job. So it's irreversible. We must insist that the Government of Canada blow the whistle on this, suspend these projects, and consult Canadians and First Nations in order to establish a real, sensible, society-oriented policy on nuclear waste. if you don't mind, could we make our presentations and then have the questions and answers afterwards?
That's the way it works.
Yes, I think so, because we had one indication of a question here. Thank you.
J'ai une présentation PowerPoint. Bon, Gilles Provost, j'ai été journaliste pendant 40 ans au Devoir et à Radio-Canada. Maintenant, j'agis comme représentant du Ralliement contre la pollution radioactive, qui est un organisme qui s'est créé il y a 2 ans au Québec pour regrouper des gens de langue française parce que la plupart de l'information sur le nucléaire est disponible en anglais. Et aujourd'hui, aujourd'hui, je voudrais vous présenter 4 documents qui expliquent le problème et qui justifient notre conférence de presse ici aujourd'hui. Le premier, il va être présenté demain à l'Assemblée de la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire ici à Ottawa. Et puis, c'est un document qui fait le point sur, comme l'a dit Gordon tout à l'heure, sur 4 réacteurs particuliers suivants. On les voit. Il y a Douglas Point à Kincardine en Ontario, Gentilly 1 en face de Trois-Rivières au Québec, la centrale NPD qui est juste sur le bord de l'Outaouais, et puis le réacteur expérimental de White Shell. Et puis, suivant. Donc, le document explique très bien que toutes ces installations sont en voie de déclassement et qu'ils sont en stockage sous surveillance en ce moment et que il y a des plans approuvés maintenant pour les démolir et on définit leur état final où ils devront se retrouver. L'état final suivant, c'est que tous les réacteurs devront être démantelés, tous les bâtiments devront être démolis et l'état final des lieux, c'est ce qu'ils appellent la friche industrielle, c'est-à-dire un terrain vague, propre, admissible à un nouveau développement industriel. Dans le cas de NPD suivant, dans le cas de la centrale NPD, du réacteur NPD qui est dans une région sauvage, on promet même que le site n'aura aucune restriction. À la limite, on pourrait y faire un parc pour enfants. Suivant. Donc, la promesse que le gouvernement a toujours faite, que la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire a toujours garanti, c'est que, ultimement, tous ces sites-là vont retourner à l'état naturel. Le problème suivant, c'est que les laboratoires nucléaires canadiens veulent maintenant changer l'échéancier, d'une part, mais changer aussi, surtout, l'état final dans lequel on va laisser les lieux. Et puis, suivant, et là, on arrive, le document le dit très bien que les installations vont cesser d'être des centrales en voie de déclassement. Elles vont devenir, pour l'éternité, des dépôts de déchets radioactifs. Waste Repository. Alors, c'est ça qu'on appelait tout à l'heure des mausolées de béton, et c'est sur le bord de la rivière des Outaouais. Et puis là, quand on regarde le résumé du document, ça c'est le petit bout, il y a un coin en français, on présente les 4 centrales, les 4 réacteurs comme des installations prototypes de gestion des déchets. Donc, il n'y a pas seulement ceux où c'est déjà annoncé qui vont devenir des sites de gestion des déchets, mais on les présente toutes les 4 comme si on avait déjà décidé de les remplir de béton avec les déchets nucléaires dans le fond. Le deuxième document sur lequel on veut attirer votre attention, c'est un document qui est apparu il y a quelques semaines sur le site de l'Agence canadienne d'évaluation environnementale. Il est disponible seulement en anglais. Et alors, à gauche, vous avez les objections c'est en 2 colonnes. À gauche, c'est les objections des gens qui s'opposent au bétonnage de la centrale de White Shell. Et puis, à droite, c'est la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire qui répond aux questions, aux objections. Et c'est intéressant de noter que c'est le tribunal qui va trancher le débat qui répond à la place des promoteurs. Suivant. Alors, l'opposant ici, il cite un document de l'Agence internationale d'énergie atomique, comme quoi la mise en tombeau, donc le remplissage de béton, n'est pas considéré comme une stratégie de démantèlement et ça ne devrait pas être une option lors d'un arrêt qui est permanent et planifié. C'est le cas ici actuellement, c'est des arrêts permanents et qui sont planifiés. Qu'est-ce que la Commission répond? La première tache jaune en haut répond « Oui, c'est vrai, la mise en tombeau ne peut être une solution que dans des circonstances exceptionnelles, lors d'un accident grave, par exemple. » Alors, donc, ils reconnaissent que c'est vrai que la Commission de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie atomique s'y oppose. Deuxième tache jaune, ils disent « Malgré ce document de l'Agence internationale, au Canada, les demandeurs ont le privilège de choisir leur stratégie de déclassement et de démolition et de la justifier. » Puis comme on l'a vu, c'est pas une liberté qui touche juste la stratégie de déclassement, c'est aussi les objectifs finaux à rencontrer. Troisième document, la politique canadienne, pourquoi justement les promoteurs ou les propriétaires de déchets ont une telle latitude? C'est parce que le Canada a une politique canadienne qui tient en seulement 3 paragraphes. Vous les avez ici en français. Le premier paragraphe, c'est une simple déclaration de principe. Le deuxième, c'est de dire le gouvernement a la responsabilité d'élaborer des politiques, mais il ne l'a jamais fait. Et il dit que les propriétaires de déchets doivent s'acquitter de leurs responsabilités conformément au plan approuvé d'évacuation des déchets. Le problème, c'est que le gouvernement fédéral, qui est le principal propriétaire des déchets des déchets radioactifs au Canada, n'a jamais soumis ou fait approuver son plan d'évacuation des déchets. Alors, et ça, c'est la politique. Troisième paragraphe, principe du pollueur-payeur. Il y a quelques mois, il y a une quarantaine de groupes environnementaux qui ont dénoncé cette absence de politique à l'Agence internationale, lors d'une conférence de presse à New York et auprès de l'Agence internationale de l'énergie atomique. Et puis là, à ce moment-là, le gouvernement canadien puis la Commission disaient non, 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 il y en a des politiques. Alors, ça nous amène au 4e document dont parlait Gordon tout à l'heure. Il y a Francis Scarpaleggia, qui est député fédéral du Lac-Saint-Louis au Québec, qui a demandé au ministre Jim Carr, ministre des Ressources naturelles, si on avait raison de dire. Et la réponse, la première ligne, « In short, Canada does not yet have a federal policy for the long-term management on non-fuel radioactive waste. » C'est sa première phrase. En bref, le Canada n'a toujours pas de politique fédérale pour la gestion à long terme des déchets radioactifs autres que le combustible nucléaire. Et puis après ça, il commente les 3 paragraphes de la politique cadre qu'on vient de vous montrer. Donc, et puis la conclusion de tout ça, M. Jim Carr qui le dit lui-même, c'est que ce sont les propriétaires de déchets qui doivent proposer leur propre stratégie de gestion et d'élimination des déchets. C'est le vide total. Et ça, c'est les 4 documents qui justifient notre intervention aujourd'hui puis qui montrent qu'on a raison de protester. Voilà.
I'm O. Hendrickson. I've, for 30 years, been a researcher for Concerned Citizens of Renfrew County and area, which is a very small non-government organization based in the Upper Ottawa Valley, close to the Chalk River laboratories. Next, please. In 2011, Ian McLeod documented very well the radioactive waste legacy at Chalk River. This includes the shutdown NRX and NRU reactors, over 100 other contaminated buildings, including some used for nuclear weapons plutonium production during the Cold War, liquid reactor waste, 3 reactor cores dumped in the sand, contaminated soil, groundwater, and vegetation, high-level waste fuel rods, tanks of liquid high-level waste from plutonium and from medical isotope production, solidified medical isotope wastes, commercial wastes from industries, hospitals and universities, and so forth. These wastes create a Government of Canada liability at Chalk River alone of almost $7 billion, and more than half of that results from the Cold War activities during the 1940s to 1960s. The International Atomic Energy Agency has developed safety requirements for managing these wastes. The IAEA recommends that above-ground landfill-type facilities only be used for very low-level waste. A waste mound, such as Gordon Edwards mentioned, is not a near-surface facility. The IAEA uses that term only for engineered trenches or vaults at the ground surface or up to a few tens of meters below ground. Then for intermediate level waste, which is more active, some of the reactor components that Gordon mentioned, the IAEA recommends caverns, vaults, or silos between a few tens of meters and a few hundreds of meters below ground. And such caverns, vaults, or silos could be part of a geological disposal facility. And if properly designed and sited, such a geological disposal facility could receive all the waste types. Next. The Government of Canada lacks waste policies and strategies conforming to these IAEA safety requirements. In 2014, it created Canadian Nuclear Laboratories, or CNL, as a wholly owned subsidiary of AECL. And then in 2015, it gave all its shares in CNL to a consortium of 5 multinational US, UK, and Canadian corporations. And then it contracted those corporations, that consortium, to reduce the federal nuclear liability as quickly and cheaply as possible. The consortium is proposing construction of a massive waste mound at Chalk River Laboratories for permanent disposal of all federal waste now in storage or waste that will result from future decommissioning activities, and entombment so far of the NPD and White Shell 1 reactors. Next. But the IAEA says that entombment is not an option in the case of planned permanent shutdown. It may be considered a solution only under exceptional circumstances, such as following a severe accident. Next. For over 40 years, the Government of Canada had proposed that reactors be dismantled and that reactor sites be released for unrestricted use. But then in 2014, with no public notice, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission convened a so-called hearing on the NPD reactor, the Junti 1 reactor, and the Douglas Point reactor. That was held before a one-person panel consisting only of CNSC President Michael Binder. Dr. Binder gave AECL a 20-year license, transforming those federal reactors into prototype waste facilities undergoing decommissioning. Next. This is a slide showing one of several reactors at the Savannah River site in South Carolina that was used to produce nuclear weapons from 1954 to 1988. Next. And then this reactor, the P reactor, has been entombed. The U.S. Department of Energy is now promoting entombment of non-military reactors based on their experience. And Canada, led by AECL, CNL, and CNSC, appears to be following this U.S. lead. In the case of the NPD reactor, CNL would demolish above-ground structures and put all the demolition debris into the reactor vault before entombment. Only the reactor stack, which provides habitat for chimney swifts, would remain above ground. Next. This slide is taken from the Natural Resources Canada inventory of radioactive waste in Canada. CNL intends to transport waste that are not entombed with reactors to its proposed giant radioactive waste mound at Chalk River. And some waste could come from commercial facilities as well. Next. This giant Chalk River waste mound would hold 1 million cubic meters of waste. It would be 20 to 25 meters in height. 33 hectares of existing forest would be cleared, and the mound itself would occupy 11 hectares. On that slide, you can see that wetlands are shown bordering the site in the lower and upper left. Next. After closure, the mound would deteriorate. As shown by the blue arrows, Perch Creek would carry radioactive contaminants to the Ottawa River, and that would happen for millions of years. The area of the mound already has high radioactivity from nearby leaking waste management areas, including the burial site of the NRX reactor core that was damaged in the 1952 accident. Plumes of radioactive elements such as tritium and strontium-90 discharge into Perch Lake and the surrounding wetlands and just west of the proposed mound site and flow through Perch Creek into the Ottawa River. Next. After signing a GOCO, government-owned contractor-operated contract, annual parliamentary appropriations to fund AECL and CNL's decommissioning and waste management activities, including studies for the waste mound and entombment projects, increased fourfold. With no public input, minimal federal oversight, and no federal policy, foreign-owned companies are being given large amounts of public funds with a broad mandate to conduct decommissioning and waste management activities at federal nuclear facilities. Next. Studies of the feasibility of geological facilities in Canada date to the 1970s, but other countries have moved ahead with geological facilities for their low and intermediate level radioactive waste. This figure shows a facility in Finland that conforms to IAEA safety requirements. Next. The finished facility has tunnels that are bored several tens of meters into crystalline rock. Low and intermediate level waste are transported to separate silos through these tunnels. Next. And here's a close-up of a silo for low-level radioactive waste at the finished facility. Next and final slide. Some Chalk River buildings, such as the Plutonium Recovery Laboratory, which is the white building just on the very far right, middle right of that slide, have large amounts of long-lived intermediate level wastes, or ILW. CNL initially proposed to put ILW in its proposed mound, but then it withdrew that proposal. The current decommissioning plan for Chalk River includes a 5-year siting exercise for an ILW facility. This was to begin in 2014, and then design and licensing would be in 2019, construction in 2026, and operation in 2036. However, in December 2017, CNL submitted a new plan to CNSC, a new plan that omits any ILW facility siting process, and it delays the start of any design work until 2026. So are taxpayers getting value for money from the government-owned contractor-operated contract? Not in our view. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you guys taking questions right now, or are we welcoming?
Yes, I think we can.
Yeah, okay. All right, Julie Van Duzen, UCBC.
Yeah, hi. So you've thrown a lot of information, acronyms, facts, so we have to boil this down. So you can just tell us very simply, what is the best way to get rid of this stuff?
We don't know how to get rid of this stuff. It's impossible. We have to, the fact is radioactivity cannot be shut off. We have no method known to science for getting rid of it. All we have is techniques for storing it and keeping it out of the environment. Essentially, we can do this. We know how to build containers that can withstand environmental factors for decades or even centuries, but not forever. And this is really the problem, the radioactive waste problem, which the nuclear industry never put forward in the early stages, the first 30 years of the nuclear age. So we're now facing this problem and trying to pretend that we have solutions. These solutions, in our view, are neither scientifically justified nor ethically justified. But it is a societal problem, not an industry problem. We feel that there's a fundamental failure of leadership here in that the government of Canada is allowing private for-profit companies to decide what they consider to be most convenient for them. Now, the only reason why they changed their plans, as stated with regard to the mound, putting intermediate level waste into that mound, is because of the uproar from citizens groups up and down the Ottawa Valley. 18 municipalities in the island of Montreal passed resolutions against this, many other resolutions up and down the Ottawa Valley, and so they have basically retreated from that due to public pressure. And now what they're doing is they're putting the mound project on the back burner, and they're putting the decommissioning of the reactors on the front burner. And that's why the decommissioning of the reactors by in situ concretization, turning them into concrete waste storage facilities, that has now been put on the front burner, and that's what they're trying to get approved. We feel that you have to nip this in the bud if you think that it's a bad idea, and that's why we're calling this press conference today, in order to alert people to the fact that this is the beginning of the age of nuclear waste in the sense of plans to abandon this nuclear waste.
So by putting it in the container, so you say that, I guess, it keeps it there for decades, but it doesn't protect people like 100 years down the road or whatever?
Well, that's why Finland has gone for geological caverns, and that's what the IAEA recommends. So certainly, we should be investigating that. That should be part of the government policy to investigate those sorts of recommendations from the IAEA for a longer-term way of dealing with it. It's not necessarily a permanent solution, because some of the caverns that have been constructed to date have had serious problems, like the waste isolation pilot project in New Mexico for some of the federal waste in the United States. However, if such a cavern was designed such that the waste are properly packaged, that could be monitored, and they could be retrieved if anything goes wrong, it would be far better than the proposals that we're being faced with now.
Carl Myers?
Thanks. Yeah. So it seems pretty straightforward. You put these things next to water sources, and they'll start to leak radioactive waste into them. But do you have proof of that happening? Do you have proof that their designs are necessarily going to lead to leaks?
I don't think the burden of proof is on us to prove that they're going to leak. The burden of proof should be on the regulator in the industry to prove that they are not going to leak. And this proof is not forthcoming. In Germany, there were 2 underground repositories for low and intermediate level waste, the kind of waste we're talking about here, not irradiated nuclear fuel. One of them was called the ASSE-2 project, ASSE-2. And it is now acknowledged by the German government to have been a complete failure. And it was leaking for 10 years before the industry even told the government that it was leaking radioactivity. Now the German government has allocated $2 billion to take the waste out of that repository because it was improper. It just simply is not a solution that is acceptable. That's only one project in Germany. There's another one called the Mausoleums project, also an underground facility for low and intermediate level waste, which is also buckling and collapsing, and the German government has not yet decided whether or not to retrieve the waste. But we feel that the waste should be retrievable because of the fact that we humans are fallible, and we do not know a permanent solution at the present time, so the waste should be, we believe, properly packaged and available to be monitored and retrieved at any time when things start going wrong, because they can be repackaged. But if they're put beyond human control, If they're put in a condition where they're not retrievable, then you simply have to live with the consequences, and we believe that that's simply unconscionable.
And in terms of the waste mound proposal, right in the environmental impact statement, it says that the mound will deteriorate and radioactive wastes will enter the Ottawa River. And then it's just an argument, how much do you allow and what is acceptable to future generations that may not want to be faced with that.
Okay, and in your estimation, is CNL proposing this type of structure because it's the cheapest?
They make that abundantly clear in the environmental impact statement. They give highest priority in their environmental.
There's no technical reason why they couldn't put it in a mountain or something like
Oh,
that?
absolutely none. They actually have very superficial analysis of alternatives, but they say they want the mound because it's cheap.
Yeah. The difficulty here is that they are contracted. They're just hired guns, and but they're not being told what to do. They are telling us what to do. So they're saying, okay, we as the contractors, we are saying this is what we're going to do. Well, who gives them this right? We're our elected representatives. They should show themselves. You know, they have to speak up, and this is not happening. I believe that our government, federally and to some extent provincially, is asleep at the switch. Now, of course, they're tolerating this, and they are putting $1 billion of Canadian taxpayers' money. They're pouring $1 billion a year into the Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, which has been reduced in size over the last 3 or 4 years from 1,600 down to a staff of 40. And they're getting $1 billion a year. Where is this $1 billion going to? Well, it's going mostly to the consortium. So these private companies are making lots of money and getting lots of studies done by their other companies in overseas and down south, and it's a gravy train. But they're really not. It's not AECL that is calling the shots. It's these companies, the consortium, that's calling the shots. Now, they say they have to have the approval of AECL, so they just got to get those 40 people together and make sure they say yes.
And the president of ACL used to work for one of those companies, so there's not a good, in our view, avoidance of potential for conflict of interest there between the contractor and the contractee.
Also, these consortiums also have a shady history. For example, SNC-Lavalin has been suspended for 10 years from the World Bank, I think it is. Mm-hmm. Is it the World Trade Organization or the World Bank? They can't even bid on overseas projects because they have confessed to unethical behavior in overseas contracts. I believe they're also up on charges for fraud related to the Montreal Super Hospital, SNC-Lavalin. There's other companies, for example...
I'll do. CH2M has actually pleaded guilty to time card fraud at its Hanford site.
That's another nuclear waste facility.
And they're one of the members of the consortium, and they just overbilled the government for the time of their employees.
So they don't have an absolutely sterling reputation, and the question is, who's really calling the shots here?
Mia Robson, CP.
You say that this is the sort of potentially the end of the nuclear age and the nuclear waste age coming, but there's a lot of people who are saying that nuclear energy is the solution to climate change. So are we really moving away from nuclear energy, or are we just about to create a whole bunch more of these problems?
That's an unanswerable question at the present time, for sure, and you're right. They are planning to launch a whole new generation of small modular reactors, and by the way, that's what the real interest of this consortium is. They want to shove the nuclear waste into what they consider convenient packages off-site, so that they can use those same sites to to produce a new generation of nuclear reactors called small modular reactors. There's a conflict of interest. We feel that when it comes to the nuclear waste and the fact that it is a possible threat to human health and the environment, that we should have an agency in charge that is independent of the nuclear industry, so there's no conflict of interest. That was proposed by the Seaborne panel of some years ago, and it was also proposed, that was with high-level waste, it was also proposed by the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Plant. Every independent commission in Canada that's looked at nuclear waste has said the same thing. We should have an independent agency, so there's no conflict of interest.
The nuclear industry will only be able to enter into another generation of reactors with huge government subsidies. The nuclear industry started with all those reactors that we've been showing you. Those were all federally funded and run. That's where people learned how to run reactors, how to build and operate. And the only way we're going to see more is by more massive government subsidies. So, and you look at the renewable alternatives, and they're competitive in a free and open market now.
We just have a few minutes left before our other speakers come and join us. I guess we will be also available for questions after the other press conference. So we only have a few minutes left before those people join in. So, Mia, just Mia, Mylène.
Moi, je voulais savoir pour le projet de dépotoir nucléaire de Chalk River, quelles sont les indications que ça a été mis de côté? Monsieur disait it was put on the back burner.
Ah, c'est juste que ils ont ralenti l'échéancier. Actuellement, il y a des négociations privées derrière des portes closes avec le gouvernement, la Commission de sûreté nucléaire, mais il devait y avoir des audiences publiques avant la fin de 2018 et c'est remis à une date indéterminée. Donc, dans ce sens-là, c'est pour ça qu'on dit qu'ils ont enlevé la pression sur ça et qu'actuellement, ils essaient d'accélérer plutôt l'autorisation du bétonnage des réacteurs.
Et par rapport aux centrales, est-ce que vous pouvez élaborer un petit peu plus sur Gentilly?
Bien, Gentilly, ça nous inquiète beaucoup parce que Gentilly est aussi présenté comme un centre de gestion des déchets maintenant, alors que c'était un réacteur qui devait être démoli et transformé, ramené à l'état naturel. Et le gouvernement a mis des milliards de côté pour que ça se fasse. Hydro-Québec a mis... Non, dans ce cas-là, c'est le gouvernement parce que Gentilly 1 est de propriété fédérale. Et donc, ils ont mis des millions de côté pour le démanteler, pour ramener le site à son état originel. Et on a bien peur que maintenant qu'ils vont avoir établi des précédents avec les deux autres, que celui-là, il va passer dans le même moule. Et c'est justement ça qui nous amène, parce que le document qui va être discuté demain à la Commission de sûreté nucléaire, il met les 4 réacteurs de propriété fédérale dans le même dossier et il n'est pas clair du tout. C'est justement, c'est presque évident que les deux autres dont on n'a pas encore discuté vont suivre dans le même pattern.
On a le temps pour 2 petites questions. OK, Dylan, puis ensuite Claudine. Peut-être juste une question sans complémentaire.
I was just wondering, what's actually happening tomorrow. My understanding is that they're going to talk about this at this meeting, but that they're not actually making a decision, but you guys want them to actually come up with a plan. Is that accurate? They're not making a decision tomorrow, it's just a presentation.
The license is for 20 years. 2034 is when the decommissioning of these, the prototype waste facilities, it next comes up for licensing. So in theory, there won't be another public hearing for until 2034 on this. No opportunity for the public.
But you're right. Tomorrow is not a decisional meeting. Tomorrow is an information update from CNL for the commissioners, and that's true.
Claudine Richard, RDI. Pour Chalk River, les inquiétudes sont les mêmes aussi pour l'entreposage de ces déchets-là, le dépotoir?
Bien, Chalk River, actuellement, c'est un immense dépotoir et il suffit que une marmotte est capable de défoncer la membrane autour, les racines des arbres peuvent la défoncer. Alors, c'est vraiment pas une installation sécuritaire pour garder des déchets pour des milliers d'années. Ce dépotoir-là va être rongé par l'érosion d'ici 200 ou 300 ans. Et ça a l'air court là, d'une certaine façon, mais 200-300 ans, là, je veux dire, ça nous ramène dans le passé, au début de la colonie. Là. Donc, quelle va être la situation dans 200-300 ans? Et on sait que les déchets, eux, vont demeurer. Il y en a beaucoup de ces déchets-là dont la toxicité n'aura même pas commencé à diminuer dans 300 ans.
So I think we're going to,
I'm going to bring up Theresa.
yeah, people are going to join in,
McClenaghan.
and then we'll take other questions.
So, Paul, you just get replaced by Theresa,
Yeah.
I guess.
Will they be giving comments first, or
Sorry?
will they be giving comments first, or just
We're
taking
going to take
questions?
the order, just this 1, 2, 3 order that we had before. I'll start, and then Gilles.
Okay, so you have a comment
Yes,
as well?
I have a press statement.
It's meant to, okay. So you will start again?
Yeah, it's the same order, except that Dr. Owen is replaced by Theresa McClenaghan. Oh, and Chief April's not here. She couldn't come. So Teresa's the third one.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Oh, yes, thank you. So, wait for your cue.
Okay.
One, two, three. Any questions and answers?
Non, elles sont trois finalement.
I'm sorry, Teresa? No, the chief is not here. She couldn't come. Yes, that's right. Yes, sorry, I forgot to tell you that. The chief couldn't make it.
Ouais, merci.
I think I'll say a few words about the chief's absence before. I think I should add that.
Is that something he wants you to say?
Huh?
Something he wants you to say, or you'd be fine with you
I'm sorry?
Something he'd be fine with you saying.
Oh, yeah, it's a she.
Chief, okay.
Who's talking about it? Who's talking 1 minute?
Okay, so Mr. Edwards will make another statement, and then Mr. Provost, and then Theresa McClenaghan. Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you very much. Chief April Adams Phillips of the Kanesatake could not be here today. She sends her regrets. But she asked me to make a statement briefly on her behalf that the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus of Ontario have joined forces and created a task force on radioactive waste, and they're very concerned about the very same issues that we're talking about, but from this perspective of the fact that these Native people regard the land as integral to their very existence, and they feel that to proceed as we are now proceeding is unconscionable again, and in violation of their own fundamental rights. There is, I just should mention to you that Chief April Adams Phillips was part of a delegation in at the United Nations, which you can view the presentations on the United Nations website. I can provide you with the link. And Dr. Ole Hendrickson and myself were there as well as Grand Chief Joan Norton of the Iroquois and the Grand Chief Patrick Madabi of the Anishinaabe Nation. So that's available. So my statement, pardon me for the repetition, but we felt that we wanted to talk about the decommissioning of these reactors, but not as an isolated event. That's why we wanted to have an information session that dealt with it in a more general context first. But the press conference is really focusing on this bétonnage of nuclear reactors.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Maybe we should leave more time for questions, because I feel there's a lot of time for questions. There's a lot of questions.
Yes, okay.
And so maybe we can just proceed with the statement.
I'll proceed right away.
Faster.
For many decades, pardon for the repetition, for many decades and up until a few years ago, it was well understood in Canada that nuclear reactors would be carefully dismantled at the end of their useful lifetime. The radioactive materials would be meticulously packaged and labeled and shipped off-site, awaiting ultimate disposal in some kind of engineered repository. The site where the old nuclear reactor once stood would be returned to greenfield status, perfectly safe for unrestricted use. But then the Harper government decided to dismantle the Crown Corporation, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, recommended selling off the reactor division to SNC-Lavalin for $15 million, slashing AECL's staff from 3,600 to 40, and hiring a consortium of profit-oriented multinational corporations to take over control of Canada's nuclear waste legacy liabilities. In a 180-degree turnabout, the consortium swept away these past plans, obliterated previous promises, and advocated a quick and dirty approach to the final decommissioning of these federally owned nuclear reactors. Instead of being dismantled and removed, the radioactive structures of the NPD and WR1 reactors in Ontario and Manitoba would simply be encased in concrete and abandoned on site. This crude approach, which we consider an abomination, is explicitly rejected by the International Atomic Energy Agency, except in extreme circumstances, such as a serious reactor accident, which may make it impossible to dismantle the reactor structure in a conventional way. We are urging all citizens and elected representatives in Canada to denounce this quick and dirty approach to reactor decommissioning. For the federal government to allow these plans to proceed will be a betrayal of public trust. We call upon the Trudeau government to suspend these impending projects, which are being funded to the tune of hundreds of millions of taxpayers' dollars, and to initiate a public consultation process with First Nations and other Canadian citizens to develop a detailed federal policy governing the long-term management of human-made radioactive waste resulting from the fission process. At the present time, there's no meaningful federal policy on either the long-term management of nuclear waste other than irradiated nuclear fuel, or on the decommissioning of nuclear reactors and the safe sequestration of the associated radioactive waste. Speaking as a citizen of Quebec, I would like to personally urge the government of Quebec and the National Assembly to denounce the federal government's laissez-faire attitude in allowing such in situ decommissioning to be accepted as a legitimate procedure. For if these projects go forward, the federally owned Gentil 1 reactor at Bécancour may end up as a perpetual concrete radioactive waste burial site as well, situated right beside the St. Lawrence River, halfway between Montreal and Quebec City, posing a radioactive threat to the mighty river for hundreds of thousands of years. We should not place our future security from radioactive contamination in the hands of profit-oriented multinationals, some of whom have already been found guilty of unethical and even criminal behavior in relation to other multi-billion-dollar nuclear cleanup operations in other countries. Where are our elected representatives on this issue?
Oui. Moi, comme représentant du Ralliement pour la pollution contre la pollution radioactive, je veux dire, je représente surtout des Québécois, des francophones, qui jusqu'à maintenant ont eu énormément de difficultés à obtenir de l'information en français sur tous ces dossiers-là. Par exemple, dans le cas du dépotoir, au départ, la consultation publique avec les audiences publiques, tout le document était disponible seulement en anglais. Il a fallu demander à la commission d'accès, la commission des langues officielles que l'on traduise le document en français. Et là encore, la plupart des documents que j'ai cités aujourd'hui, tout à l'heure, ils sont disponibles seulement en anglais. Donc, il y a une obligation de rejoindre la communauté en francophone qui, comme par hasard, est juste en aval du dépotoir de Chalk River puis de la centrale NPD qu'on veut maintenant cimenter. Alors, je veux pas répéter tout ce que les autres ont dit, mais notre ralliement demande que le gouvernement fédéral, Énergie atomique du Canada et la Commission canadienne de sûreté nucléaire respectent les engagements qu'ils ont pris depuis des décennies. Le Canada doit démanteler tous ses réacteurs nucléaires désaffectés et non pas simplement les remplir de ciment. Et il doit remettre les sites dans leur état originel, comme ils s'y sont toujours engagés et comme c'était garanti par la Commission de sûreté nucléaire. Et comme nous entrons maintenant dans l'ère des déchets nucléaires, parce que des centrales nucléaires, des nouvelles, là, pour le moment, il n'y a aucun projet en Amérique du Nord pour des nouvelles centrales, et l'Ontario vient de prolonger la vie de ces centrales actuelles-là parce qu'il n'y a pas les moyens de les remplacer. Alors, nous entrons maintenant dans l'ère des déchets nucléaires et nous demandons qu'Ottawa se donne enfin une vraie politique contraignante sur le démantèlement des réacteurs nucléaires désaffectés et sur tous les déchets radioactifs autres que le combustible. Et on veut que ce soit une politique que la Commission de sûreté nucléaire devra appliquer. C'est pas à la Commission à élaborer des règles et elle n'a pas non plus à prendre les règles de l'agence CSA là, qui fait des règles, qui laisse l'industrie faire ses propres règles. Et enfin, nous demandons que cette future politique sur les déchets radioactifs soit précédée d'une vaste consultation auprès de tous les Canadiens, y compris les Premières Nations. Il y en a eu une consultation avant les règlements sur les déchets nucléaires. On a fait le tour du Canada pendant des années. Maintenant, sur le combustible nucléaire, excusez-moi. Alors que maintenant, on veut reprendre l'opération et que ça devienne vraiment un consensus au niveau de la population. Qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec ça?
Thank you. My name is Theresa McClenaghan, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Today, our organization, along with 40 others, including First Nations, NGOs, and citizens groups, signed and sent a letter to the Auditor General of Canada asking him to undertake an inquiry whether the Government of Canada, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission are overseeing and expending public funds for nuclear waste management and nuclear reactor decommissioning in a responsible manner, and to inquire whether these agencies are handling these matters in ways that are compatible with sustainable development principles. The reasons for these urgent petitions include the fact that we believe Canada lacks the checks and balances in its nuclear governance system, and that the involvement of multiple agencies and departments is needed in order to strengthen that system. Canada has just begun to face the monumentally difficult and expensive task of safely managing over 7 decades accumulation of nuclear waste. We believe that money is being spent by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited without due regard for economy, efficiency, and environmental protection. In our view, these failures and inappropriate expenditures of public funds create serious risks to the health of current and future generations of Canadians and our environment. Why do we hold these views and ask for the Auditor General's oversight? Consider that after privatization, AECL's subsequent spending of public funds to the consortium tripled, reaching almost $550 million in each of the last 3 years and exceeding $1.5 billion in just 3 years. This is an alarming rate of public expenditure. The stated federal share of the country's nuclear waste liability is $8 billion. Despite that level of spending, what the private consortium has proposed so far are 3 waste management projects that won't properly deal with the federal nuclear waste at all. As you've heard, a massive site is proposed for a near-surface facility holding so-called low-level radioactive waste, but this waste includes long-lived, very long-lived radioactive waste, and putting it in near-surface facilities contravenes IAEA guidance. 2 sites on the edge of 2 of Canada's iconic rivers are proposed to be filled with grout and left in place forever, despite acknowledgement that these facilities containing highly radioactive materials will inevitably be sources of radionuclides emitted and transported to the Ottawa and Winnipeg rivers for thousands of years, respectively. Once again, this approach violates IAEA guidance, as entombment is meant to be a desperate measure suitable only for large-scale accidents such as Chernobyl and Fukushima, not a routine way to deal with the hazardous legacy of our nuclear power experiments. By way of the government-owned contractor-operated contract, the GOCO contract that you've heard about, incentives have been misplaced, resulting in these least-cost, poorest of solutions, rather than the best solutions from a sustainability perspective. An excerpt from one of the governing contracts between AECL and the privately owned consortium, CNL, says it plainly, quote, CNL shall seek the fastest, most cost-effective ways of executing the decommissioning and waste management mission, including disposal of all waste. This is included in the letter, which is available for you today, to the Auditor General. The CNSC, the regulator, is poorly equipped to provide the needed oversight, in our view, since it is working with a Nuclear Safety Act that is long overdue for review, dealing with a poorly functioning Environmental Assessment Act, and no policy guidance de facto from the elected government of Canada nor from the public. As a result, we're calling on the Auditor General to use his statutory powers to inquire into these matters and provide a report to Parliament.
Thank you. Now go to questions. Todd, did you have a question?
Sure. I heard a lot about this will be around for thousands of years, millions of years, forever. The NCL put out a press release yesterday, said this, in just 200 years this will be down to a background level of radiation. Who's wrong? I mean, what are they getting wrong then?
They're getting wrong is that they are simply ignoring the fact that plutonium, for example, will be part of the waste that goes into the reactor burial. Because it gets into the pipes. The whole primary cooling system gets contaminated. We have a table of isotopes in the steam generators of nuclear reactors here in Canada, for example, which has 6 different isotopes of plutonium and several isotopes of americium. Plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, and when it disintegrates, it turns into another substance which has a half-life of 700 million years. In the actual structures of the plant itself, we have nickel isotopes, which have half-lives of 76,000 years. I mentioned carbon-14, which has a half-life of 6,000 years. So even tritium, when they talk about 200 years, they're simply waving their hands and ignoring a host of radioactive materials, which they themselves have listed as part of the waste that is in the defunct reactors. I have written a brief myself, which compiles a list of those things, showing hundreds of thousands up to millions of years for various ones of these isotopes. That's not irradiated nuclear fuel. That's the stuff that's in these defunct reactors themselves. So I think that what we're getting is public relations bafflegab and not facts.
Also, earlier in the technical briefing, you mentioned the best way is to dismantle it, I guess transport the material and put it in a geologically stable repository, which I imagine would be somewhere in the Canadian Shield. How do you overcome the NIMBYism that's going to come from a lot of the First Nations groups? I'm talking beyond the ones you mentioned that you're allied with, James Bay Cree or the Swampy Cree or the OG Cree, or any of those groups in the Canadian Shield where they may be asked to take this material.
I don't think the NIMBY question is really appropriate in terms of the First Nations people. I think that they have, and along with many other communities, they have simply advocated that the first step should be to stop producing this waste, that since we don't have a solution for it of a permanent nature, we shouldn't be making it. And in fact, that's what government reports stated back in the 70s, is that really there should be no further building of nuclear reactors unless these problems can be solved to the satisfaction of society as a whole, not just to the satisfaction of the nuclear industry. So I think we've missed out an essential step here. And that is that what do we as a society, what are we willing to put up with in terms of these wastes? Now, even on the land where the Chalk River site Chalk River, of course, is one thing. These other sites are something else. But if we take the Chalk River site, for example, even without leaving the government-owned, the Crown land where that Chalk River facility is sited, you could move the waste 20 kilometers away from the Ottawa River and still without leaving Crown land. So I think that these things are oftentimes just excuses for not doing anything. To put it right there in a wetland, less than a kilometer from the Ottawa River, in the case of the NPD reactor, it's only about 200 meters maximum from the Ottawa River. I mean, to turn this site into a radioactive waste repository of permanent proportions, just on the basis of the say-so of a consortium of people who were hired to do the job, is ridiculous.
So if I could add, that's fundamentally the problem, is that these proposals are being made by the consortium without public consultation, without proper public input. These ideas about in situ decommissioning just came out of the blue. I think, frankly, they were hoping to fly them under the radar. It sounds very innocuous to talk about in situ decommissioning. And then people started to dig into it and realize that what they were proposing was grouting those research reactors and leaving them right there on the banks of each of those two rivers, which, as Gordon says, begs questions about what's planned for the other demonstration and research reactors that the federal government owns. But the problem is that with nuclear waste policy, we don't have a policy that's been developed properly with public input. And it's appropriate that people on transportation sites, people in the communities where the waste may end up, people where the waste is today, and the Canadians in general all have a say about appropriate factors to take into account. And we don't pretend, as Gordon has already described, that we have the answers. But what we do know is that a proper inquiry hasn't been made, and that choosing a solution because it's the fastest, most cost-effective way is absolutely the very most wrong way to go about it.
Moi, je voudrais rajouter que les déchets qu'on met dans le dépotoir actuellement, ils veulent même pas nous dire les quantités qu'il y a. J'ai fait une demande d'accès à l'information pour avoir accès à des documents qui décrivaient combien de plutonium, combien d'uranium, combien de... et on m'a dit non, c'est secret parce que ça pourrait aider des terroristes. On est prêt à abandonner ça pour l'éternité à la surface du sol, mais c'est trop dangereux pour nous dire combien on va en mettre parce que les terroristes pourraient le savoir. Alors, à ce moment-là, ils peuvent bien dire que dans 200 ans, il ne restera plus rien, mais on n'est même pas capable de savoir ce qu'il va y avoir dedans.
Julian?
I don't know if you can answer this in French.
I won't be able to
No,
answer
okay.
that.
So people are, yes, worried about the environment, but a lot about what happens with their money. So do you mind if you can re-explain a little bit what are your worries around that?
The worry with the money is that the amount of public funding being allocated to Atomic Energy of Canada Limited has tripled or quadrupled in the last 3 years. Subsequent to the privatization and the new contract. But what we're seeing for that money, for that $1.5 billion, are these extremely poor proposals that are the supposedly cheapest and fastest things to do with the waste. Of course, it's going to be cheapest to leave a reactor in place, throw all the top buildings into the basement and pour cement on it. But that's not the best answer, and it's admitted in their documents that it's not going to hold that material in place for the long time frame that the materials are radioactive. So we're spending a lot of money on the consortium, and we're not seeing a proper process, we're not seeing public input, we're not seeing good solutions, we're not seeing sustainability principles reflected in the decision making. And furthermore, we think the oversight mechanisms by the regulator and by the governments of the day is failing us because we're not seeing these kinds of inquiries being conducted in terms of how these monies are being spent and what we're getting for the money. We have, as I mentioned, a very poor oversight legislation that needs to be reviewed. We have lots of concerns about environmental assessment and an environmental assessment system that is not providing for good decision-making on sustainability principles. At the moment, we still have SIA 2012, which is being reviewed by the federal government, but even in the proposed environmental assessment legislation that's been passed by the House of Commons and is going to the Senate this fall, we'll see a lot of the hallmarks of SIA 2012 remaining. So we're very concerned that we can't even say, oh, well, environmental assessment will allow us to ask these questions and make good long-term decisions because the principles are not embedded in that legislation.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that later, maybe. I could add a little side note to that.
It seems that people aren't going to really pay a lot of attention unless they think that health is at risk. So you talked about poisons and toxins and heart attacks and cancer. Is that a risk that's there now, later, to the people who live near there? Is there proof of that? Like, what is the health risk now and later?
Well, I was on a Science Council of Canada study called Policies and Poisons, which is headed up by Dr. Bates, who is one of the leading lung cancer specialists in Canada. He's passed away now. But they came to the conclusion that when it comes to carcinogens, and mutagens, things which cause cancer, things which cause mutations of the genes, that there really should be no acceptable level of exposure to begin with. You shouldn't say there's a certain level of exposure which is acceptable. And the reason for this is because, as in the case of asbestos, we've discovered that there is no such thing as a safe level because all carcinogens, not just radioactivity, but all carcinogens have the property that that it's called the linear model. It says that if you half the exposures, you'll get half as many cancers, but the people who get cancer will be just as dead or just as sick. And if you cut that down again by half, you're going to have again half as many getting sick, but they'll be just as serious illnesses. So there isn't.
Risk now to the people who live there. Should they be selling their houses and moving away?
No.
Is it, like what is the actual risk?
They should be preventing the creation of a source of carcinogens that will last for hundreds of thousands of years into the future, and which they themselves will be unable to monitor because they don't have the necessary equipment or measuring devices.
I understand, but you said that there was poisons and heart attacks and strokes and
Oh, that's all in the literature, the medical literature.
Evidence that living near one of these sites, or I'm just wondering, what is the health risk that is proven?
I'm basing this on international studies, the U.S. UNSCEAR, which is the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, the National Academy of Sciences BEER reports, which is the biological effects of ionizing radiation. There have been a series of these reports issued over the years with multi-panels of experts, usually 24 experts, and they publish these reports based on studies of specific populations that have lived in a certain circumstance, that have been exposed to certain radionuclides, and the literature has confirmed that this is the way, these are the diseases which are caused, and that they are linearly related to the exposure. So that's what that's based on. It's based on our knowledge of the materials.
Right. If I can just add, for the two entombment projects or in situ projects, we've specifically asked for information about the pathways to the rivers, and that information is forthcoming but not yet provided. And it's among a long list of questions that the public has asked CNL as proponent of these projects to answer, and the regulators and Health Canada and others have asked a long list of questions to these proponents. And that's why these projects are now sitting with indeterminate timelines. They were on a fast track. They're now sitting with indeterminate timelines because of these incredibly long list of questions, fundamental basic questions about characterizing the radioactive waste there, characterizing the pathways to the environment, and answering questions like, in what year would you expect the grout to be deteriorating and seeing radionuclides emitted to the Winnipeg River or the Ottawa River, rather than just saying, yes, it would happen eventually, which is as far as the answers have been provided so far. But in addition to that, I might add, if I may, that we also can't say that the public should only pay attention if the health effects are being manifested today, because we have a long-term obligation to future generations. There's an environmental principle of intergenerational equity where you don't just say, well, if it's not going to manifest itself today because the grout won't deteriorate in my lifetime, therefore I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to ask my politicians to hold the proponent accountable. I'm not going to ask the regulator to be as stringent. Then I'm failing, my children, my children's children into the future. And we would be in a bit of a pickle, I may say, if we had generations, not even 7 generations, not even 50 generations before us, but a generation or 2 before us who had made these decisions and left us with these kinds of consequences. We are the first couple of generations coping with this experiment in nuclear power, which, we think has turned out very badly because of this legacy.
Et je voudrais rajouter, quand on parle des dangers, actuellement, les déchets, ils sont gérés à court terme dans des barils, etc., dans des bâtisses qui sont surveillées, mesurées régulièrement. Alors, nous avons... La Commission de sûreté nucléaire n'a même pas demandé aux promoteurs, par exemple à Chalk River, de démontrer que les déchets, une fois dans son gros tas de déchets, là, dans son dépotoir, que ça va être au moins aussi sécuritaire que l'état actuel. Ils n'ont même pas demandé la preuve. Ils n'ont même pas demandé l'analyse. Alors, qu'est-ce que vous voulez que nous, on vous dise, là? C'est simplement inquiétant.
Mia, then Dylan.
So what Julie was also trying to get at. These facilities exist today. They're not going to be built, they do exist. So what risks are there to the people who are living near there now? Not once they're encased in concrete, not once they start creating this mound. What risks are there to people today?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question, and I can't really give you a good answer for it. But when you start demolishing, when you start taking things apart, you stir up dust, you release radioactive material in various forms. I'll give you an example. In 2009, at Bruce Power Generating Station, they refurbished the Unit 1 reactor, and as a result of carelessness on the part of the management, 500 workers, over 500 workers, were exposed to breathing plutonium-contaminated dust on a daily basis for almost 3 weeks. And this is known as the alpha contamination incident, one of the more serious failings. Now, the reason for that is that under normal operation, when the reactor is operating normally, the workers are not exposed to that material. It's only when they start pulling the tubes apart. It's like opening up a vacuum cleaner. You know, all the dust is there. Well, that dust is radioactive. And this stuff turns out to be, it was plutonium-contaminated dust, which doesn't register on the radiation monitors because it's a low penetrating form of energy. It's one that doesn't really set off the alarms. And so it wasn't till almost 3 weeks that they took air samples and found out that the workers had been breathing this material for 3 weeks. So it's in the process of dismantling and pulling things apart that you spill things into the environment. You try not to, of course, but it happens.
So why would we dismantle?
I'm sorry?
Why would we even bother to dismantle them then?
Well, that's a good question too. It can be done safely. It was not done safely in this case. The workers were told they didn't need to wear respirators. If they had been issued standard respirators, they would have been perfectly safe. They would not have breathed any of this material. That's why I say it was a failure on the part of the management, because they should have known about this. They should have taken the appropriate protective measures. Why did they not wear respirators? I suppose it's to save time and to make the job go faster. And again, it's the same principles that Theresa McClenaghan has mentioned here, that to try and save money and do it faster is not necessarily the best approach when you're talking about eternity.
Dylan?
I was wondering about the White Shell facility. From the reporting that I've read, the folks in Pinawa aren't really concerned from what I can see. I don't see a lot of groups. I see one sort of Manitoba person named in your document here. It seems like, if anything, they're kind of doubling down. They're looking at private sector ways of doing nuclear energy. I'm just curious, is this a concern for people who live there? And if not, why not?
I can't really answer the question. I think that there's a lot of unawareness in society generally. And in the case of Pinawa, this is what we call a company town. I mean, the people who live in Pinawa that's a town that was created, really, I believe, to house the White Shell Nuclear Research Establishment, which is more or less the western counterpart of a Chalk River. We had the Ontario-based Chalk River establishment, and they wanted something that was more pan-Canadian. And so they established the White Shell Nuclear Research Centre.
That being said, there are retired scientists from AECL who've been writing letters to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in the environmental assessment process for White Shell, as well as for Rolfton, and who are very familiar with that facility and raising very serious concerns about it, and asserting that there is insufficient justification for the change to the already approved environmental assessment for decommissioning that facility. So they're very knowledgeable people who are raising questions with the Commission, and in my view, that's partly why that facility is now on an indeterminate timeline while they are answering questions. There also is a lecturer at Manitoba, or University of Winnipeg, pardon me, who's also a journalist and has published a number of articles in the Winnipeg Free Press, who's quite familiar with the history of that site, and some First Nations as well who are concerned there.
I can send you a copy of that letter. It's signed by a number of scientists at White Shell who are concerned about this and raising serious questions. Thank you.
A dispute over pensions right now involving Pinawa and I think Chalk River as well. That doesn't really play into this, is that correct?
I'm sorry.
No, I don't know about that, and these letters have been penned for the past few years.
Yeah, that's right.
Vous avez une question, Mylène? Allez.
Mylène Crête de la presse canadienne. Ma compréhension, j'ai déjà visité le site de Chalk River et ma compréhension dans le briefing que j'avais eu, c'est qu'il y avait déjà des éléments radioactifs dans le sol et dans certaines nappes phréatiques, qu'ils étaient surveillés constamment, puis que l'idée c'était de se débarrasser entre autres de ces sols-là pour les mettre dans le fameux dépotoir nucléaire dont on parle. Alors, est-ce qu'on a une indication que ces éléments radioactifs-là se sont déjà transportés dans la rivière des Outaouais? Et deux, en quoi est-ce que d'essayer de contenir ces éléments radioactifs-là serait pire que la situation actuelle?
Bien, le fait de les... Non, il faut les contenir. Il faut les contenir. Il y a des déchets là qui sont dangereux et qui doivent être contenus, mais c'est pas en les mettant dans un gros sac noir à la surface du sol au milieu d'un marécage qu'on va les contenir. C'est ça le problème. C'est que la solution qu'on apporte, oui, il y a des problèmes réels. C'est un des endroits, la base, l'endroit, le terrain de Chalk River est un des endroits les plus contaminés au monde sur le plan nucléaire. Mais oui, il faut le nettoyer, mais pas en mettant ça dans un gros sac noir au milieu d'un marécage, à flanc de colline, puis en disant « Ah, on a réglé le problème ». On n'a rien réglé. D'après les règles internationales, ça doit être à plusieurs dizaines de mètres dans le roc sous la surface du sol. C'est ça la réponse.
Et est-ce qu'on a des indications que ces éléments radioactifs-là se sont déjà retrouvés,
Oui.
par exemple, dans l'eau de la rivière des Outaouais?
Bien, il y en a actuellement. Le fond de la rivière des Outaouais, devant Chalk River, est contaminé. Les sédiments sont contaminés. Et justement, il y a eu des discussions entre la Commission et les laboratoires nucléaires canadiens pour savoir si on devait les retirer ou si on risquait pas justement de tout remettre en circulation puis de polluer plus loin dans la rivière en soulevant ça. Et pour le moment, ça reste sous observation, mais il y a une grande zone des sédiments dans le fond de l'Outaouais qui est gravement contaminée par des déchets nucléaires actuellement. Il y a eu, on le sait qu'il y a eu des émanations de tritium gigantesques, mais ça c'est de l'eau radioactive. Ça s'en va. Une fois qu'elle est partie, et puis là, ça paraît plus. Bon, alors, on peut pas dire qu'il n'y a pas eu de contamination. On sait qu'il y en a eu. Ça n'a pas été mesuré à l'époque. On sait qu'il y en a encore et on ne sait pas quoi faire avec. Et c'est ça la situation. Mais c'est clair qu'il faut régler le problème. Et c'est justement pour ça qu'on sonne l'alarme aujourd'hui. Il faut des solutions durables, des solutions sécuritaires qui vont l'être pas juste pour nous, mais pour les générations futures. C'est pas des choses qui vont disparaître dans 100 ans, dans 200 ans ou dans 300 ans. Et on veut pas que le Canada se retrouve parsemé de petits dépotoirs nucléaires comme ça à chaque endroit où il va y avoir eu un réacteur nucléaire au cours des années. Je veux dire, c'est pas ça la solution.
If I might add, there also is a problem with standards today, and this gets at the questions you're asking about health effects. So today we have the situation with tritium being emitted from the Canadian nuclear power plants and contaminated groundwater in some cases, and emissions to surface waters in many cases, and emissions from air affecting groundwater. And sometimes we have spills. And when you see those announced in the media by the industry and by the regulator, they will say, you watch next time, they will say it meets the Ontario drinking water standards. Well, the Ontario drinking water standards are set at a unit of becquerels per litre, and the number is 7,000 becquerels per litre. And so they'll say that the drinking water that's been thus affected is within that standard. Two independent science advisory committees to the province of Ontario, one in the early 1990s and one a few years ago, have advised the province that the number should be 20 becquerels per litre. And the number remains at 7,000 becquerels per litre. Every time this comes up, the industry doubles down. They'll stand up in public hearings, I've been there, and say, we could meet 20 becquerels per litre, but I don't know what happens because we don't see it then change to 20 becquerels per liter. And therefore, it means they can say with these plumes, with this contamination, with this ongoing spill events, when they happen, and they sometimes would be more than 20 becquerels per liter, well, we meet drinking water standards because they're looking at 7,000. So and why did the two advisory committees say that? Because radioactive standards have been set in a different way than chemical standards, and basically they're 70 times less protective of the public than the equivalent metric we use for chemical standard setting vis-a-vis cancer in particular. So just because you hear these reassurances doesn't mean there isn't a public health concern, and you will hear at any of the hearings about nuclear power plant licensing, many members of the public and environmental doctors and others, knowledgeable commentators, saying these numbers are too high, these exposures are too high.
We have 3 minutes left. Any other questions? Mylène?
Est-ce que vous trouvez, vous avez parlé du régulateur, là, donc la Commission de sûreté nucléaire, est-ce que vous voyez des similitudes avec la façon dont le dossier du pipeline Énergie-Est avait été géré par l'Office national de l'énergie à l'époque?
Ben, c'est certain que c'est pas un tribunal indépendant. Les fonctionnaires travaillent en étroite collaboration avec les proposeurs et ils essaient d'ajuster. Alors, à un moment donné, quand ils ont fait un compromis entre eux en disant, bon, OK, si tu fais ça, on va tolérer ça, etc., bien, quand tu arrives en audience publique après, les décisions sont déjà prises, là. Je veux dire, la commission travaille jour après jour à discuter avec Énergie atomique du Canada, avec les laboratoires nucléaires canadiens. Donc, c'est certain qu'ils ont pas le recul et à un moment donné, ils sont obligés de faire des compromis pour en lâcher un peu pour en obtenir de l'autre côté. Et puis, c'est très difficile après ça, si la population proteste en assemblée publique une fois que tout est entendu, ben c'est bien difficile d'écouter le public.
Last one, Julie?
Yeah, can I just, so basically you're saying the government has no policy, that the government has no policy for this, that this consortium is out for itself. It's looking for the cheapest way to store this waste. It's doing it in such a way that it's very likely to be a health hazard in the future, down the road. We don't know exactly when, but probably. You want consultation, so with people and with indigenous groups and so on. So just two quick questions. Why now, and what makes you think just consulting the public and other people is going to come up with a better way than we've got now?
Bien, on a parlé tout à l'heure des problèmes de transport. Bien, justement, si on peut consulter le public à la fois sur le transport des déchets, sur les risques à la santé, sur le meilleur endroit où les mettre, etc., bien, on va pouvoir arriver à une solution qui rejoint les intérêts de tout le monde.
Élaborer, comment ça se fait que vous pensez que le public aurait des meilleures idées que ce qui arrive maintenant?
Ben, parce qu'ils ont fait des audiences publiques et ils sont inondés de protestations du public, de mémoire du public, et ils sont pas capables d'y répondre. Ils sont obligés de retarder les prochaines échéances et puis ils prennent des mois pour réussir à répondre justement aux objections du public.
Isn't that why they're not consulting the public? Because the public won't want any part of it. They won't.
You're always, when you're looking at environmental decision-making and environmental assessment, I often say in many spheres, we're choosing the least bad of a number of bad solutions. For sure, when we're looking at our energy supply going forward, we shouldn't be repeating this mistake anymore. We are repeating it, but we shouldn't be repeating it. We know better now. And then when it comes to dealing with the problem we've already created, there is no good answer in front of us. So we have to choose the least bad of a bunch of bad solutions is where we're at.
Apparently I mentioned that in the 70s when the nuclear waste issue first emerged in Canada and elsewhere, They had extensive public hearings. They had, the Seaborne panel had hearings in 5 different provinces, public hearings. They had hearings with First Nations. It was a 10-year process of environmental assessment. And a great many things came to light that were not put forward by the industry originally. The industry thought it would be a slam dunk, that it would be an easy matter to get rid of this nuclear waste. In fact, they said publicly that it was not a technical problem at all. It was only a public relations problem. Going through this process means that academic scientists can bring their testimony to bear, other government departments can bring their expertise to bear, the rights of citizens down the line, medical expertise. There's not a lot of medical expertise within the nuclear industry here in Canada. And all of these different views and points of expertise can converge to provide a much more realistic picture of the nature of the challenge. And that's what's happened with the high-level waste. We have not had a similar procedure with regard to low-level waste. And it's important to realize that the Seaborne panel that was established at that time was an independent panel. It had people who were somewhat associated with the nuclear industry, people who were not at all associated with the nuclear industry. So there was a built-in balance of views in the panel itself. And all of this is really essential for major decisions which are going to affect society on such a grand scale over such a long time. There is a temptation to view such thing as the NPD reactor as a very local concern, because it's just there it is, up there in the God knows where, you know, quite remote, and so on. But in fact, it's the thin edge of the wedge. The point is, if they do this with that reactor, what are the implications down the line? What is coming next? And I think it reflects a question of, are we going to approach this question with the sobriety and the scientific acumen that it deserves? Or are we just going to let people say, well, this is an easier way to do it, let's do that? So it's a fundamental question of how we determine the future of our society with regard to these wastes. Don't forget, I mean, the government has already acknowledged that they're going to spend, the utilities are going to spend up to $22 billion now to find a home for the high-level waste. That's a huge amount of money. And granted that it's a lot of money, but everybody feels that, yes, it's really necessary because these wastes are so toxic that we have to take every precaution that we can. We're not doing that with these other wastes, which in many cases are the same materials at a lower concentration. They're not different from the irradiated nuclear fuel. They're just lower concentrations of the same kind of material. So if you do a bad job of storing that waste, then the stuff that you're trying to protect with the high-level waste is getting out into the environment anyway, simply because you didn't do a good job at the lower end of the scale.
Thank you, everybody. We're all out of time. You can ask questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you.